call this meeting to order for the October 11th Planning and Zoning Commission regular meeting. First of all, we'll have the commissioners introduce themselves, starting with Mel down on the end.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay. I'm Mel Roop.
Jared Nanke.
Ted Gambogi.
I'm Ken Mabarak.
Harry Marshall.
I'm George Sheets, the chair, and we have Jim Lamerson, the city council and liaison to the Planning and Zoning Commission here. I don't see any other elected officials. I believe we have a new community development manager here that I'll let George introduce her.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for stealing my thunder. Yes, we have a new community development director for the city. This is the position was the one previously occupied by Tom Geis, so you're familiar with him. This is Bryn Stotler. She is a month in, I believe, a little over a month in.
Over a month.
So.
Step in. Good morning, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. I'm delighted to be here this morning for our first Planning and Zoning Commission meeting since my start date in August. For those of you that don't know me, I have lived in the downtown Prescott area for the past 22 years, and I've worked in development for the majority of those years. Jurisdictionally from the Yavapai County Development Services Department, and also in the private sector for the developers of the Prescott Lakes Master Plan, American Ranch, Wickenburg Ranch, etc., the M3 companies. So I'm happy to be working with all of you. I know we have great level of experience across all of your positions, and I look forward to future meetings. So thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the first item on the agenda is the approval of 2 sets of minutes. Oh, I should introduce Darla Eastman, our recorder here and overseer. Caretaker. We have 2 sets of minutes. Everyone had a chance to review them? Yes. Yeah. Do we have a motion then? We can do both of them at the same.
Do both of them at the same time?
Yeah.
I so move that we approve the minutes from the May 31st and the July 26th meeting.
Second?
Second. Okay. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. Raise your right hand. Okay.
Aye.
Thank you very much. The first item on the agenda after the minutes is a site plan review for a 40-unit apartment complex out on Blooming Hills Drive. Not all site plans for commercial projects come to the planning and zoning, so George, why don't you explain what the rationale for us reviewing that site plan is?
Certainly, sir. About a year ago, the City Council approved a revised water policy that addresses how they allocate water to projects. They effectively tied water to either a subdivision plat or to a commercial site plan approval for a development such as this one. Multifamily developments are generally considered similar to commercial, and they're handled through that process. So the purpose of the site plan reviews as created by Council's water policy was to have you, as the technical reviewing body for the city, look at a site plan and render a determination that this site plan was practical or practicable, that you could in fact develop the site this way. Council does not want to allocate water and tie it up for a period of time for a project that might not be developable as it's drawn, as it's initially shown. They want to know that it's had some additional review prior to that. With a subdivision plat, that review occurs through this body. It would come to you, you would make a recommendation to council for a preliminary plat. So council tied that process already established by city code and state law to site plans, things that aren't a subdivision plat. They said, well, the other process works just fine. Let's send those non-subdivision plat requests for water through the same review process. Hence, site plans come to you for larger residential, typically multifamily residential type uses before going on to council with a water service agreement for council's determination later. So that's how we got here with this particular project. It is a request for a multifamily development. It's 40 residential units. The property, the overall site area is 2.12, slightly over 2 acres. Based on our zoning, the business general zoning for the site. By the way, business general is the zoning on the site, but it allows for residential uses. Our zoning is a hierarchical type of zoning code, so the higher intensity use you have allows all of the lower intensity uses beneath it. So while this is zoned commercial, it allows for residential in either multi or single family. They've chosen to come in with a multifamily proposal. Again, 40 residential units. It's 40 residential units in a single structure. So we often see multiple buildings on sites. In this case, because of the compact nature and the shape of the site, they went with a single structure. There are 3 things we generally look at for a site plan review from staff side. They are in compliance with the setback requirements for the zoning district. They're in compliance with the required parking for the zoning district, and they're in compliance with the building height maximums for the zoning district. Those 3 things have been reviewed for this site. We've determined they are in compliance with the setback criteria, and again, because it's business general, it's as little as 10 feet on the setbacks in almost all 3 sides. Again, this thing sort of only has 3 sides. Parking spaces are based on number of bedrooms plus the number of units, so you have to have a parking space per bedroom plus a half of a parking space for each dwelling unit, so 1 guest space for every 2 units. They meet that requirement. That adds up to 81 spaces required, and they have 81 spaces provided. And then the other issue of building height, they're proposing a structure roughly 35 feet. It's just slightly over that. Maximum building height allowance is 40 feet for multifamily and 50 feet for generally everything else in this zoning district. So they're well below their minimum or maximum limitations on height. They've provided us with a landscape plan, at this stage sort of a rough landscape plan. We didn't give you a copy of it because that will be required at the building stage, and that review is generally a staff review. I do have a version I can show you to give you a general idea that their intent is to provide a lot of tree coverage within the parking spaces and within the landscape area around the building. But again, at this stage, that might not ultimately be what it looks like. It's just for reference at this stage. They have to provide, once they've gone through the review process and obtain a water service agreement, they have to provide the city staff with a full building permit application. That application will include all of the structural details for the building, all of the grading and paving and layout for the site design, and a landscape and lighting plan, which will all be reviewed during that building permit process. So this is something that sort of was presented to us just as a, here's what it might look like.
Well, you know, in this particular case, it's in Prescott Lakes in an HOA, and so they do have spatial arrangements regarding landscaping and lighting, the dark sky lighting and all that. So
And those
the
Prescott Lakes
developer will have to work closely with them also,
correct.
besides the city.
And the HOA requirements, the requirements of the association there are generally higher, substantially higher in most cases of landscaping than the city's requirements. Most city requirements, most city codes are minimum codes. So we're not looking for enhanced landscaping, we're looking for the basics. Complying with the owners association, the CC&R requirements will exceed anything we would require. There is some question about access to the site that has come up in some discussion, so I just want to address this. There's an odd driveway that just sort of comes in off of here to give a second way in and out off of Blooming Hills Drive. So this is Blooming Hills Drive. This is their primary road connection. There's a shared driveway here that's shared with the already existing development that was intended that way, that was designed into the plat for that subdivision to share driveway access wherever possible to avoid too many driveways on a curve. And if you're familiar with that area, that roadway curves at that point. So there's a single driveway access. They share that. That'll be their primary public access. This provides a secondary access for fire vehicles only. It's emergency ingress, egress. It will be chained or gated in a manner acceptable to the fire department. That detail will be provided to us at the time of the building permit submittal. And that's to provide an additional way in and out should there be something blocking the primary access into the site. So fire can get in if they need to, and they can evacuate people if they need to via that secondary. So it will not be open to the public. The only other question that we've had has been regarding potential use of the site as like a multifamily residential apartment complex adjacent to an already existing multifamily, and traffic impacts. Traffic impacts need to be reviewed and approved. They'll provide us some additional details, again, with the building permit submittal. It's not something that's normally done at a preliminary site plan stage. There are some costs involved in that, and there are normally costs that are attached to the property at the time that all of the other engineering for the site occurs. So they'll have a traffic engineer look at it, they'll have a grading and drainage engineer look at it, and then of course their structural engineer will be involved in the plan development itself. At this stage, I'm going to conclude my remarks. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. We do have a representative for the development here if you have questions of them.
Well, I'd like to hear from the developer in terms of what this apartment complex is. Is it senior apartments only, or, you know, just a general overview on the project? Hello, please introduce yourself, your name and your address.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, I'm Chris Fergus with Ferguson Associates out of Phoenix. I'm the architect, and I am here with the development company representative, Tim Emberlin. We initially weren't going to do senior. We were contemplating a mix, but I believe at this point we are going to entertain senior. We have a meeting after this meeting, but I was just told by the developer he would like to do senior apartments here. I know it's parked for family, a mixture of family and senior, so we probably have a few more parking spaces than we need for senior, but that is our approach at this time.
Mm-hmm. Well, under state law, don't you have to have 80% or 55 or older, whereas you can have up to 20% for that are younger? That's what the Prescott Lake Senior Apartments has that as a guideline next with 135 units next to this.
I believe that is correct. It would be an age-restricted project, and I believe there is a percentage that you have to comply with in order to realize the parking benefits, if nothing else. But we didn't need to reduce the parking. We have enough for family, but there is a need for senior here, and I think the developer would like to develop this as a senior project.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
The fire department access road,
Yes, sir.
that's not open to the public, so will it be blocked off in some manner?
Yes, sir. Mr. Worley had mentioned that it will be chained or gated as per the fire department requirements, and we will provide a detail on the construction plan showing that it will not be open to the public because of the turn there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that again is a Prescott Lakes deal in terms of the design of the gate, or like some do have chains, but most of them are gates of some kind with a spatial lock on them.
Yes, sir. They may require, there may be a decorative gate requirement because it is in Prescott Lakes, and in which case we will comply with their details and their requirements.
Any other questions for the developer here?
Well, I had a couple questions about the fire access road. How did that come about? Is that staff requirement? What?
Normally, the fire department is concerned if there's only a single way into a project. A traffic accident, for instance, at the entrance, the shared access to the two parcels could limit fire access into the site for emergency services, whether it's a fire or a medical emergency. So when a case like that occurs, there's no absolute requirement for two full accesses, but the fire department needs an alternative way into the site. This gives them that alternative way into the site. It allows for them to have an unobstructed access. There won't be anyone else using it, so it should never be blocked by vehicles, parking, any of the things that can happen with a public entrance into the site. The development next door, while this is their primary access, they do have a secondary access also. And we would anticipate a similar requirement for any apartment complex in circumstances similar to this.
Well, the explanation sort of negates my concern. Setting at the bottom of the site, setting at the top of the site, and now that you've just told me that it's going to be seniors, if you've set there on the site, the cars come up that hill zipping pretty good. Do we have a set speed limit to somewhat control?
I can't recall whether it's posted at 35 or 25.
I believe it's
25.
I believe it's 25.
Sounds like a question, an enforcement question.
It's residential, but it is a collector street also.
25 miles an hour?
Not always. Sometimes it depends on volume and how it's connected to other streets in the area. So it may be 35, but it certainly wouldn't be any higher than that.
Well, it seems to me like there's plenty of land there. You're beyond the median. Why wasn't a full width drive put down there so it could be public access?
You mean the secondary?
The secondary.
The fire department wants one specifically for them. Their request was specifically, let's reserve this so it doesn't have people parked on it. It won't have delivery trucks sitting in it. It will only be for the fire department for their access, or police department for their access. So the request was specifically for that secondary access, just for the fire folks. It saves them from having to deal with a situation where a delivery truck's trying to get in and get stuck, or people are parking because of some event on the site. That access will not have any of those concerns.
George, I heard everything that's said about this. I only have a couple of issues on this site. I think it's a pretty good site plan, although I can't see a lot. I don't know. I don't have a sense of what these buildings look like, but that's probably not under our purview anyway. It's always handy to have a sense of what it might look like.
We did submit exterior elevations. I don't know if...
I thought you might have. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
That's okay, George. You don't have to pull it out
I have
now.
some in the
Well,
car
that'd
if
be
you want to
kinda
see
good
them,
to see,
just
though.
pencil
Would have
sketches.
been. Mr. Fergus,
Yes, sir.
I'm not excited about this driveway, this 23-foot driveway being only for fire. I don't get it. To me, it makes no sense. And maybe I could have a better answer than, I don't see the curve that you're talking about. I think it's a great spot because I think the main entrance is one of the more confusing entries to two properties that I've ever noticed in our town. Ted and I went out there and looked at it together, and that's going to be very confusing. When you have 70, 80 more people pulling into that thing, it's a sharp turn after you turn into it. I think people are going to miss that little driveway there and go into the parking area and have to come around. I don't understand what's being said as to why this access to the south has to not be, at least for deliveries or other activity into this project.
Yeah.
It's a long road. Certainly it's wide enough. You could make it a couple feet wider if necessary. If nothing else, I'd make it a right in, perhaps maybe a right out. But I don't know why this has to not have two entries there. I think it's more convenient for if I'm building this apartment complex, I'm thinking it's great for my tenants to come in both ways. If there is some traffic or some engineering issues that I'm missing, I don't see it. Not that I have to understand it, but it makes no sense to me why this is only for fire.
Well, the corner parcel, which is open now, was going to be a dental office, a commercial building, and the city required them to have an additional right turn in and right turn out when they worked to design that one. And that's the same situation with the same medians and everything as this one.
Are you saying that there was plans to which is not on our site plan, by the way?
Right.
We don't have any information as to what's surrounding this. You're saying that this property in the southwest corner was going to be an office?
That was on the corner of Prescott Lakes Parkway and Blooming
Chairman?
Hills there.
I thought you were
that
talking
other
about
one,
here.
but it was also on Blooming Hills, and the
Mr.
city
Chairman?
was recommending a right turn in and a right turn out there.
The
so
property
that-
the chairman's talking about is this one. This is a future parcel. You'll be seeing that. It's also being proposed for apartment use. So the one we're talking about today is this parcel, And again, if you look at this, there's the curve we were talking about. That curve comes up to this primary access, and then it goes on down past those two sites to reach Prescott Lakes Parkway over here. So this curve was of some concern, which is why we limited the number of accesses. So you can see the existing site has two ways in and out. Both are designed to be shared. So this property will share that access with them. This property shares that access with them. It was initially
understand all
designed
that.
that way to reduce the
Again,
number
I
of
just don't
driveways.
understand why this can't have more access than just fire, whether it be entry, maybe not exit, delivery. I just don't see that this has to be a minimum of fire. So that's my only comment on that.
If I could address that, there were some, we didn't have, as the architect and developer, we didn't have any issues with two ingress and egress points.
I didn't think you would. That's why I'm
No,
asking
sir.
the
In fact,
question.
it made sense. There were some issues with an easement down in that area, and this was directed by the fire department that they wanted specifically their own ingress and egress point. See,
And that doesn't surprise me
we
either.
weren't required, because we're only 40 units, I think the cutoff is 50 units, where you're required to have two ingress and egress points. We weren't required, although we wanted it,
Full.
but
Two full ingress
Because
egress.
isn't it
Correct.
28 on a secondary, 28 or 30 on a secondary?
I'm not familiar with
Yeah,
those
when
numbers.
we had the Tenney property, remember they were just
28 or 30.
number of residents.
I-
you-
it's
when
no-
you have to
Whatever
have
it
a-
is, it's there. I think it should be used. So that's my only thought.
I don't disagree.
The other concern that I have also up there is the landscaping. You drive into that site, it's covered up. The first thing you see is a trash dumpster location. And then the next, I drove, like Ken said, I drove right into the parking lot
So did Ted.
looking for the ingress, even though I had the plan laying in my seat.
I think that the ingress egress, and we'll address that with we provided a preliminary landscape plan, but I think both sides of that probably need to be cleaned up so it's easier to spot, because I drove by it the first time myself looking for the site, so.
The other question I have, why can't we use ground cover instead of shrubs that grow up and then block the visibility lines?
Well, I think at the entrance, we would use a ground cover, nothing that grows over 3 feet high, because there are visibility triangles that we have to maintain, nothing over 3 feet. So I do think that will be entertained. We certainly, that is a requirement that we'll have to address at the main entrance.
And there is a requirement for a certain number of shrubs and a certain number of trees in the land development code for commercial and multifamily residential sites.
Even
So
if
we
they
apply that
promote-
minimum requirement.
Even if they promote lack of visibility and accidents probability?
No, not necessarily. It's subject to the layout of the landscape architect. So as they lay the site out, they should be taking that into consideration. And we do look at that during the building permit review.
Yeah, well, I mean, Prescott Lakes has this landscaping group that will look very specifically, and they've had a lot of problems with plants growing over 3 feet and things, and so they've got standards on certain types of ground cover that's not over a foot or something they are recommending for most at intersections. So it just won't grow over, there's no maintenance then. So, okay.
While we still have our victim up here, got a couple more questions. And thank you, Mr. Fergus.
Sure, certainly.
We've seen you before here for some other projects.
Yes, sir, for
and Mr.
22
Emmerling,
years.
too. Can you really do 3 stories on something like this on 35 feet? Is that a restriction that
Well, we have.
seemed awfully low?
That's a very good question. We were fighting to get 35 feet. That was the information that I got when we first started designing it. I think Mr. Worley said we're actually allowed 40 feet.
I believe 40.
40, and this is about a 38-foot ridge line, I believe. In order to get 9-foot ceilings inside instead of 8-foot, it's nicer to have the higher ceilings. We're going to push it up. If we're allowed to go 40, we were fighting to get 35.
You should have, because that's really restrictive, today's designs, because 8-foot ceilings seem low to most of us these days.
No, exactly.
And that may be something we want to look at in our codes, frankly,
That's
in the future.
again, that's an HOA thing.
But well, we're not the HOA, though. We're still at the city. They could have tougher restrictions than we do. I'd rather see it that way because I think it's more marketable.
Yes,
And
sir.
I'm always concerned about marketability of these projects because if they're not marketable, they become a drag on
Sure.
our community. So I'd like to see. I don't have a problem if it went even over a little bit over 40 when you get your ridge lines. But
Yes.
having the design interior, I've done a lot of apartments, and I wouldn't build an 8-foot ceiling apartment complex today because the market doesn't like that.
No, it doesn't.
And so I think we have to be careful that we maybe allow them to go a little bit higher. I don't know where there'd be a issue if it went even higher than 40 feet. I don't know who would have one, but it does create a whole different process. I get that, George. My other question, Mr. Fergus, is other than parking, what design differences would you make if this were not a senior? What are the design differences between a senior and just a regular multifamily?
Well, I think that one of the main issues is this is a 3-story building. Typically, the code does not require an elevator for a 3-story building, but if it were going to be senior, then we would definitely have an elevator.
So you're having an elevator here.
Yes, sir. If it's going to be senior, we would have an elevator.
And would you suggest that might be one of the only key differences between a multifamily complex and a senior complex?
Well, I think a little wider corridors, more attention to accessibility. I mean, there are certain accessibility requirements we have to meet, but I think on a senior, typically we make, especially with a building with an elevator, all our units adaptable. So any unit on any floor, if there was a senior there that if for some reason or another experienced a temporary disability, their unit could be adapted to accommodate accessibility.
Where would your elevator be?
In the
Right there.
Yes, sir, right there.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Yeah, that's it right there. No, that's going to be the main entrance as you come in, just
George, could you
directly
point out
across.
there, you know where the
Yes, sir,
elevator
right
is,
there,
George?
right there.
So these people over on the west end have to go all the way over there to take the elevator, huh?
Yes, sir, but it's not really that large. It's only 40 units. It's not really that large of a building. It's not that much of a walk. Now, that elevator, if it's not at that end, will be more centrally located. We haven't fully designed it yet, but we do have an area for community space and a lounge and TV and an office and file room and things like that.
Thank you. I think you've answered all my questions. My biggest point is that driveway, and I'm going to suggest that they make that 2 driveways. I know the fire department's not going to love me, but they never have.
I believe there was an easement issue, was there not? This is Mr. Emberlin. He's the developer.
I've been working on this project for a decade on different things on this.
You've had a lot of projects for a decade.
Yes, sir, I have. Originally, that point there was determined, there's an easement there for the property to the south to have also an emergency exit right through there. There's an easement that comes right up there. The problem that I've seen with having that as a public entrance is the proximity to the intersection to the west, and that there's not enough room for any turn lanes. And across there, now emergency vehicles could come either way and get in there, but there's already a turn lane for that intersection right there. So public access would kind of be at a conflict with each other there, is what I've been told by
Right in,
traffic.
right out would work?
Beg pardon?
A right in, right out might work?
Possibly, but I think they were too close to the intersection for any kind of and there's all kinds of utility boxes right down there at that corner, right down there, by that
right.
residential street. And it's going to be pretty hard to logistically get all that in there. It's like too much.
That makes, thank you. You're right.
My pleasure.
There are some utility boxes there. I hadn't noticed. I had forgotten that.
Okay, you have another question?
George, Mr. Worley,
Sir?
I have a question. The handicap disability spaces, is there one van accessible, only one required?
For the number of parking spaces that are proposed, 1 van accessible space is required. Otherwise, they're required at a ratio of a 1 for every 25 parking spaces.
I'm
So
wondering,
they're actually 1 over, but we round up anyway. And one of them has to be van accessible. Just looking at the layout, it looks like they're all van accessible.
I believe they are. I don't recall. It's been a few months since we did this, but I believe they all are van accessible. And it may be that, again, this site plan you're looking at was not the senior site plan. We required less parking for senior. So we would probably add some additional handicap spaces for all senior. But we do have the room and do have the space to do it.
That was my question. If it's going to be senior, I don't know if you can get along with four.
No, sir, I agree.
Spaces.
We would add more.
Thank
Are you willing to look at redesigning that main entry, if you can't have the secondary public access, of redesigning that entry to make it more feasible for people to easily pull into this?
Yes, sir. I think we're open. The problem is we're tied into what's already there. It's already built on the property next door, and we're kind of tied into using that. In fact, the dumpster we put back around the corner, so at least when you come in and landscaped it, you pass it and don't see it. But again, we're tied into what's already there, the size of the ingress egress point, and we're kind of tied to using that. So
Well, we try not to get into design, and I'm not trying to get into design, but apparently I am. I'm just thinking that's just not a convenient entry for this property of the two. It works well for the other one because you come in, you go straight. Ted and I went out there, and Mr. Gambogi
right.
and I went out there, and we flew right past this thing, and we were looking for this property. So we went in. He had to figure out how to do a turn in here, and you said you did too, Terry. If there was some way you could do something with that curbing on that little island to make it easier for people to come in, it might be helpful if you don't have a secondary access. But
There
other than
will-
that, it's a great project.
I'm
It's a
sure
good
there will
use
be
for the
p-
project. I think 3 stories is real good. Overall, I like it. Those were my only concerns of the project here. So.
Okay, Mel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the point that Ken is making, I had a question. At the entry here, I don't recall, I was up there, but I didn't notice, is there a sign here on this property that identifies the name of that property?
You know, I believe there is.
Yes.
It was another sign planned on this side of the entrance for this property so that people could distinguish that it's two
Yes, sir, and
projects?
it's not shown
It
here,
will be
but yes,
signed.
sir.
There would be?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, that would help. I had a couple of questions about the plan. The sidewalk that goes around here in front of the parking,
Back out a little.
it scales about 6 feet wide, and I'm wondering, is that wide enough if cars are allowed to overhang the sidewalk for handicap?
For minimum access is generally 5 feet of sidewalk width, so at 6 feet, it will allow a 1 foot overhang and still maintain that 5 foot
So there
requirement.
would have to be curb stops then, wheel stops?
There will need to be wheel stops,
To comply then.
right? So you can overhang,
Land, wheel stops.
you can overhang landscaping, you generally can't overhang sidewalks.
Right.
Yes, sir. In fact, that entire curb will probably be a depressed curb for accessibility, which will require wheel stops within, I believe, 30 inches of the curb.
Oh, okay, good. My other question was about, I understand there was some concern about the drainage. The site right now slopes from southeast to northwest this direction. It's fairly flat. I calculated the slope across the site. It's just under 4% from here to here, which is fairly flat. Is there, I know we don't settle drainage here, and I didn't see a proposed drainage plan, just the existing topo. So I wanted to ask, how was the site proposed to be drained? Because you're going to be doing some cut here anyway. If you did cut on this part of the property, some fill over here, so that it slopes away from the north,
Yes, sir.
that would solve that concern. But is that a concern or an issue?
We have underground retention basins on this property, and you'll see them on the site plan, right up there labeled underground storm retention.
Right there?
They're actually prefabricated pipe chambers, actually, that go in underground, and the site will have pickups, catch basins, collection points between the building and the walkway that catch it and everything. Even the down leader, the water coming off the roof will be channeled to our underground.
The city's requirement is that post-construction flow off the site, stormwater flow off the site is no greater than pre-construction stormwater flow off of the site. There are requirements for pretreatment as well, and the underground chambers that Mr. Burgess is talking about allow for pretreatment option. Rainwater runoff off the parking lot needs pretreatment before it just gets into the city systems.
They're not cheap, but it is an excellent system, and you don't see retention ponds with weeds growing in them and mosquitoes, and, you know, it's all underground, so.
Is that a cement culvert type thing, or how is that
Pardon?
plastic or what?
They're plastic. They're domed chambers, ribbed domed chambers that you can drive over. I mean, they're designed, the fire department can drive over them. I mean, they're designed for that.
That's been a recent thing that we've been starting to do here, and I think it's a wonderful thing. I remember down in Phoenix, you probably know Tatum and Shea, they used to have this big thing right at the corner, and some mornings we'd see a car or two parked down there after a Friday or Saturday night. So I think this is a much safer way to retain water than just in a pond.
It's a good system. We used to use, in fact, up here when we did the Bradshaws, we used, I think, 9-foot, 10-foot diameter culvert pipes underground. But these new systems, they work great. They go in easily, and they don't collapse.
Mr. Chairman, as of
Once you catch it,
Well, it's detained, and I believe it perks. This system, I'd have to check the soils report, but it perks at a certain rate. And I'm not sure if this one is allowed to discharge at a certain rate into there is a drainage channel in front of the property, and it may be allowed to discharge at a certain rate into that at some point, but it is retained and perks on the site.
Okay, any more
Mr.
questions?
Chairman, as of Monday of this week, and driving past the site over on Miller Valley Road where the apartment complex is going in, those chambers, exactly as described by Mr. Fergus, were sitting out there. It's almost
yeah.
exactly the same type of chambers were sitting out there. They're going to use them for that site as well.
Touchmark, they did something similar, didn't they?
I think they did more of the pipe approach rather than these prefabricated chambers.
Well, I believe
But yes.
they needed a lot more.
Yeah.
And those chambers get expensive. So the big deal is that you don't have to dig as deep for these chambers too. So if you have bad soil or something, hard rock, chamber's a good system. But I do believe on Touchmark, I'm familiar with that project and property, and I do believe they used the 96-inch metal corrugated pipes for that one.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? Okay, do we have any members of the public that would like to speak to this? I don't see any. Okay. Any further discussion among the, yes?
I just wanted to say, as Mr. Worley said at the beginning, we're looking at, is it developable? The site is clearly developable. I can think of 6 different nice projects you could put on that site.
Yeah. Okay, any further comments? And we can vote on this, can't
Yes,
we,
sir.
today? Okay. Is anyone ready to make a motion?
I move that we approve PLN 18-00015.
Do you have a s-
Second.
Second, okay. Any further discussion?
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
Okay.
I would like, again, I like the site, I'd like to approve it, but I'd like to have a reconsideration, a reevaluation of the entries before we accept this as a final site plan.
Are you making a request for an addendum to the motion, or
I am.
you want this?
I'm asking that the motion say that the developer and the city reevaluate that entry to design it just slightly different, to make it more convenient to enter the property, especially if it's going to be the only entry into the site.
Okay.
So however we amend that, George, you can probably give us some help if my fellow commissioners are agreeable to that. But that's what I'd like to see in here.
So you could propose an amendment to the motion that city staff work with the developer to reevaluate the primary entrance to the site.
Exactly.
Okay, yes.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, in that entrance is not on our property, and we were required, I mean, I don't have any issues at all working with the city or fire department, even trying to make that an ingress egress, but we did spend considerable time looking at alternatives to this, and I believe we hit several brick walls because of its proximity to other ingress egress points. It's on the turn. I'm not sure. I'd be more than happy to. In fact, when we go to council, I'm going to bring some exterior elevations, some building plans, and some more information, and I'll be glad to look
Are
at
we
it.
the stepchild?
Pardon?
We the stepchild?
No, I did submit them. I did. I submitted.
All I'm saying is I'd like a reevaluation of that entry, and if it's possible, I'd like to make it more convenient.
No, that
That's
makes
all. If
sense.
you can't,
Yes,
you
sir.
can't, but I think a second look is all I'm asking for.
One of the things that can be addressed, Mr. Fergus is right, this is fixed. That location is fixed. So there is no moving that driveway this way or that way. What can be modified is all of the surrounding piece of property up here to provide for better visibility, to provide for signage locations, to show us some of those things. That doesn't necessarily mean it will be practical to change it, but we can certainly look at it again if you get.
I don't know who owns which land there. I can see the line, I think, is the
Yes, sir.
property.
That is the property line.
All of
that
the
dotted
access
line.
from the street
I don't want
is
to
on
get
the
into the
adjacent
design of it. I'm
property.
just asking that another review of that entry take place, that's all.
We will look at it
I'm
again.
not trying to complicate it.
Gotcha.
So
Thank you.
we've agreed between staff and the developer to do that. Do you still want to amend the motion? Okay. So you'll need your mover to agree to such amendment.
So moved.
Okay, second on this?
Second.
Second. Okay. All in favor, raise your right hand, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion passes 6-0. All right, we have the item 3 on our agenda is a temporary sign land development code regulation review and discussion. George, tell us who initiated this, how it came about. Oh, and before I do that, we had another councilman come in here, Phil Good. Councilman, raise your right hand. Okay. Hi, Phil. Say aye. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Okay, we'll move on to the explanation of the sign code.
Good morning, Commissioners. Katie Peterson, Community Planner. I'll give a brief overview of the history of it, the background that's led up to this point, and then we can go from there. I'll go over also the current land development code regulations, which are the ones in effect now, and we came up with some options that have been discussed before about potential changes. So 2015 is when there was a Supreme Court decision on municipal regulation of temporary signs, and that was related to freedom of speech protections. 2016, as a result of that Supreme Court decision, the City Council adopted the current sign regulations in the Land Development Code. This was a revision to the 2003 Land Development Code sign regulations for temporary signs. Staff research, the Unified Development Code Committee, and Planning and Zoning Commission meetings informed the current regulations. 2016, there was the council motion for a moratorium on enforcement of the adopted current land development code regulations on temporary signs. So now we're here today to begin that process again of deciding. Before you today is that decision about how to direct where we should go from here. So the existing regulations for temporary non-residential signs, I'll just go over the current regulations. One per business is what's allowed, one temporary sign per business. The size of each sign is limited to 24 square feet maximum. There's a time limit, 180 days time limit for temporary signs. They can be mounted to a wall or freestanding. There is a permit required. The details need to be included in the permit application regarding location, materials to be used, and the means of support or attachment. And the message on the sign, again, cannot be regulated. Existing regulations for temporary residential signs, there's no aggregate maximum. There's a 6 square foot maximum sign size. There's a height limit of 5 feet per sign. There's no time limit. Again, they can be mounted to a wall or freestanding, and there's no permit required for residential temporary signs. But the sign must be maintained for public safety and also to protect the character of the neighborhood, basically. Just to give, this was mentioned as an attachment in the staff report. I can either include those as an attachment to make available online, or we can remove that attachment reference. But just to review the kinds of signs, the different forms and uses of temporary signs. They can be banner signs for businesses, for events. They can be yard signs like what you see for elections or for garage sales, real estate signs. They can be those flag banners like you see there on the far left. Oh, how do I get it back? There we go. Flag banners, banner signs attached to fences or to other structural supports. They can be general like this one, remembrance signs for commemorative dates. Again, election banners or signs. So there are different forms that they can take. Temporary business signs, so before a business gets their permit for their permanent sign, often they want some kind of temporary sign to let folks know that they've come in. So those are all the different forms that you'll see around and that this section of the code applies to currently. Going over some of the ideas that have been raised before. Once this current code was adopted, there were concerns about those signs, which led to the moratorium. So now going forward, one option is to retain the existing regulations that I just reviewed. Otherwise, some other options, ideas that have been brought up before, non-residential individual temporary signs could be allowed an increase in size. There was a concern about the limit to the size of those, so we could allow an increase in the allowable size from the current 24 square feet to something like 36 square feet with no aggregate maximum for square footage. And that's again on business or commercial non-residential individual temporary signs.
A quick question, what do you mean by no aggregate maximum square footage? Does that mean you could have 10 signs?
Correct. So it wouldn't limit the number of signs. So that was based on a concern that was raised previously. Another option similarly for residential individual temporary signs, increase the allowable maximum from 6 square feet for residential signs temporary to 16 square feet with no aggregate maximum square footage. So as many as they want. For non-residential and or residential, we could impose a maximum aggregate square footage. So we could limit to 36 square foot maximum for the aggregate. Or require a permit and fee for certain types of signs. For example, banners over a certain size. Just keeping in mind that this applies to, it doesn't regard the message at all. It's just the form of a temporary sign for businesses, for events, for elections, for different kinds of events and purposes. So we can't regulate the message of the signs, just the form, the sizes. So the next step is to discuss and provide some direction on proposal to City Council, either retaining the existing code or going back to enforcing or coming up with some specific revisions to the land development code. And we did look at some other city regulations, which are pretty similar to what we have. There's some slight variations, but pretty much every city has to comply with those freedom of speech laws.
And just so you know, we're also moving forward with an introduction and discussion item for the city council at their meeting of the 23rd. So they'll be having an option to have the same conversation at that time. Following that, following your recommendations and following their discussion, we may be back to you with proposed ordinance language change for an amendment to the land development code, again, depending on how those discussions come out.
Well, several of the intersections down throughout the city, there could be as many as a dozen or more, signs now for the campaigning that's going on for elections coming up, and they're probably like 6 square feet each, and so that'd be more like 60 to 80 square feet if you total that up, and I don't see how we can really regulate that on private property.
So there were two.
Well, size and amount, but they're exceeding it already. In terms of they're probably like 6 foot each, 6 square feet each, and
There was
you can't
discussion
allow
at the
some
time.
and not others.
There was discussion at the time that the current ordinance was passed about whether to provide maximum sign sizes or maximum numbers depending separately on whether it was residential property or commercial property. Residential property, it was determined, both recommendation by this body and by the city council, that limiting the individual sign size was fine, but not the total number of signs. And while we can't regulate signs based on whether they're campaign signs or not, campaign signs are the type of sign that proliferates the most as a temporary sign. That's what you get the most of. We don't have 500 garage sale signs appear in a month. We have 500 campaign signs appear in a month when they're campaign season. We have to regulate all temporary signs the same way, but we can differentiate by certain things. The time, the place, and the manner. Time means how long can you have them up? The place is where do you put them? Can you have them on private property? Can you allow them in the right-of-way? By the way, the city council chose not to allow them in the right-of-way. They banned temporary signs in the right-of-way at about the same time that this was adopted. Again, right-of-way signs tend to be visibility issues and cause problems with traffic, so that was one of the reasons. And again, because we can't limit the type of message on a sign, you can't allow campaign signs in the right-of-way and disallow any other temporary sign in the right-of-way. You have to treat all of them the same. Supreme Court said it since the 1970s. A lot of places forgot, and the more recent 2015 decision by the Supreme Court was a reaffirmation of something they had already said back in 1970s. We've changed our code to address that. One of the ways to do it without necessarily interfering with a private property owner's right to support or oppose issues in a campaign is to not have a maximum number of signs. Just limit how big the signs are so that you don't have them paper the entire property. But if you have 10 items on a ballot, an individual property owner should be able to express his political speech via signage to support or oppose all of those. So rather than put the aggregate amount that Katie's talked about on a piece of property, they chose to simply limit the size of individual signs, not the total you could have on the site. And again, that was partly because there was a sincere desire to not limit someone's ability to support or oppose something for political reasons.
So, George, are we saying that if we have 20 items on an election, that my neighbor could put 20 signs in his yard?
Under our current regulations, yes, as long as none of those signs are bigger than 6 square
Then let's
feet.
change the code. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous to have that many, allow that many signs in a residential area. I'm not talking about the commercial. We can address that differently, but
And we have addressed them separately, so they are two different
so
questions.
I don't know how we got to this point, but we face it. My co-commissioner here, Terry Marshall, and I both live in a subdivision. That all of a sudden, we have some freedom of speech residents, and we're starting to get into some campaign signs. Well, our subdivision says no signs in our subdivision. I don't know if that and Matt's going to probably take a look at that sometime in the future. I don't know if that's legal or not legal, but that's where we are today. So we get the call, I get the calls saying, so-and-so's got a sign in his yard. I can only imagine if we allow 5 or 10 or 8 or whatever number of signs in yards, I think that's a terrible thing to clutter a
do.
residential neighborhood with.
So you know, our current
minimum.
our current sign code does allow that. There is no limitation on
No,
the
I didn't
number.
realize that. Shame on me for not seeing that, but maybe we should address that.
Yeah,
We do limit the maximum number of signs to 1 on commercial property, temporary signs on commercial property, and we set a maximum square footage for that on commercial property. Generally, on commercial property, signage is commercial signage. It's commercial speech. Commercial speech is protected differently than political speech under the Constitution and under the Supreme Court decisions over the decades. So most communities have a maximum size limitation and a maximum number on commercial properties, limiting the number of signs. Part of it is to prevent clutter. Part of it's to make sure that they haven't plastered them all over the window so you can't see in and out, which is a safety issue for the police department. And partly because often those temporary signs are inexpensive and they're put up and not maintained. They become a hazard. That's far more likely to happen on commercial property than residential property. Homeowners are more likely to take signs down and not have a flapping banner or something that could potentially be a hazard to pedestrians.
But like Mike Phan's property, there's, his main yard out there, as well as he owns some other property next to Prescott Lakes. He pretty much says, yeah, go put your signs up regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whatever you might be. It's just the freedom of speech and debate. And he's got, maybe 20 signs on there or something like that, and that's commercial property. So, there's no way to enforce that, right? We don't.
It would legally be enforceable by the code we have. Technically, it's difficult, partially because those signs come and go on a fairly frequent basis. They're not there for a year. They're not there for commercial purposes, which generally is a longer term. They're there for temporary.
Can we exclude the campaigning signs from this code?
No. Again, as soon as you determine whether a sign's a campaign sign or not, you've read the message and you've violated the intent of the First Amendment.
But it's a different type of temporary when it's just during the regulated election cycle. That's
Big Brother
different
says you can't regulate the content.
Many communities have specific time limits depending on civic events or is that the terminology they use? Is it civic events?
Civic events.
Civic events. So, an election is a civic event. So the limitations could be you can't put them up more than a month before a civic event, and you have to take them down 10 days after a civic event. But you can't say it's an election or that it's a campaign sign that you're restricting. Again, First Amendment rights trump all of those local codes that might say you can put up one campaign sign and support one candidate, but you can't support any other candidates.
Right. So when they refer to civic events, that could mean other events by
Not
the city.
just a campaign.
Right.
Earlier in the presentation, did I see a visual that said that the LDC was suspended or in 2016?
Yes, there was a moratorium on enforcement of the temporary sign requirements only. So the remainder of it was in effect. Only the temporary sign portion of it had its enforcement suspended. So
Why was that?
that was because of a number of concerns and complaints relating to primarily election-related signage. But we needed to have time to do the research to make sure that when we bring you options, when we bring you suggestions for changing the code, and if you'll recall, one of the options Katie put up was don't change the code.
Yeah.
You have that option. What we presented and what council adopted is legal. It meets the Supreme Court's decision. It meets the First Amendment rights that were reaffirmed in that Supreme Court decision. But there were concerns about a number of the aspects of it. So there were concerns enough that council decided, let's hold off. Let's let staff, the legal department, the planning department do research and find out what other communities have done to see if, in fact, there is another way to do this. And there are always changes to numbers. We say 6 square feet, why not 8 square feet? I mean, at some point, you're going to make an arbitrary determination as to either a number of signs, an aggregate square footage, or individual square footages. That's just how regulations work. Someone picks a number, and that's what we go with.
And also forms of signs. So some city, you can regulate the type of physical sign that it is.
Based on what I see around the city right now, I think the original LDC proposal was spot on.
Which portions of it?
All of it. I mean, in terms of square footage, in terms
The,
of...
the current requirements that were shown, can you back to that?
Right, but if we can't enforce it, then what good does it do?
Well, there's a difference between enforcing it and being able to enforce it. Council suggested, let's relook at it, and they suspended the enforcement for a temporary period of time to let us relook at it. We can legally enforce what's in the code. We can. It's not illegal and it's not
George,
unconstitutional.
don't we have a difficult time trying to enforce the signs?
Sign enforcement's always a difficult project.
I mean, I'm involved in a property where on one side across the street from me, there's a dozen signs in the right-of-way. Across the street, the other street, there's several signs. We have elected not to allow signs on our portion of the property, even though we have a large right-of-way in front of our property, which fortunately, you can't put signs there. So I think we have an enforcement issue too, and I think you see that within the city. So I'm just having trouble. I didn't realize, and I'm so embarrassed that I did not know this prior to today, that you can have as many signs as you want. And I think in the residential arena,
Right,
which is what
on
I'm
private
mainly
residential
talking
property.
about, because commercial, we're kind of protected. The owner of the property is probably not going to put up something that's tawdry or excessive, although they might. But my issue on both of them is 180 days is probably longer than temporary, in my opinion. But in the residential arena, I think we have to watch that stuff because you could end up cluttering a neighborhood. And there's a number of people that that in our community that get on causes, and they could get their whole neighborhood to put these signs up. And I think if you don't have an HOA or in our case an architectural committee that determines those things, it can get out of hand. And when you do have those, suddenly the argument becomes freedom of speech for people. And you have a hard time fighting freedom of speech. I think we all want freedom of speech. But if my neighbor has 10 signs in his yard, or 8, or even 4, frankly, I think is excessive. It looks like we're trying to increase the size of those signs at the same time. I think we got to look at that component.
Increasing the size is an option. Staying with what we have is an option.
Right.
Making other modifications are options. So Katie's a list of potential options.
I'm not
for you to
arguing what you're
consider.
saying. I'm just saying I'd like to see those things in this sign issue of some limitation, the number of signs on residential,
Some
not tied
communities,
to how big the ballot is.
some communities do that. What they allow is a maximum aggregate number. If you want to have 10 campaign signs in your yard, as long as they don't add up to more than the square footage maximum allowed, you can.
It could be 10-yard signs, or it could be one big banner. So the aggregate maximum
I apologize
allows.
again. I must have missed that. I thought
It's
each
not in our
sign could
current
be
code.
6 square feet.
That aggregate is not in our current code.
Right.
That's not in our current code. That is an option to allow an aggregate, and regardless of the sign. Right now, we don't have an aggregate amount. You can have signs 6 square feet, and you can have 10 of them if you want to have 10 of them. If you put an aggregate amount in, an argument we heard against that at the time we adopted the code in the first place was that because the signs generally, specifically again campaign, but also other types of temporary signs, come in preset formats, they are 18 inches by 3 feet, or they're 2 by 3. There are numbers that are very specific. That's how they're manufactured. You're forcing someone to choose how many ballot measures or candidates they can support because they have a maximum number of signs they can have, and the signs are preset in sizes. So there's an imposition there that council was trying to avoid by not putting a maximum aggregate. Limiting the 6 square feet, almost no campaign signs are 6 square feet. They're either smaller than that or significantly larger than that. Katie mentioned 16 square feet, which is the next size up effectively.
Well, I'm not sure all that you just said, but because it gets confusing. But what I'm trying to say is I think we should have a limit to the number of signs in residential subdivisions. And I like a limit to a size of it. If you're telling me that 6 square feet, you can have 20 signs that total 6 square feet, I may have a different view. That may be okay. I don't know. It's kind of junky.
I
But
think they would be called postage stamps.
I think they'd be called postage stamps. And I know that people will argue as to the size of a lot. You know, I live in a 15,000 square foot lot that has, I don't know, 150 foot of frontage or something. If I had 600 foot of frontage, maybe I'd want 2. But I mean, you can go crazy trying to please everybody. But I lived through the sign stuff down in Scottsdale, and people were furious. I'm a no sign kind of guy. I don't think we need a lot of excessive signs. I like smaller. But the residential piece just scares me, and maybe because we're dealing with it in our subdivision as we speak right now. And
Mr.
Matt
Chairman?
will be dealing with it.
Can I add
Well,
something?
yeah.
Thank you. I totally agree. I don't have a lot of concerns about the commercial part of it. I'm not a businessman, and they can speak better to that. But on the residential, I've got some serious concerns. One, with the existing code the way it is, it definitely has to be changed. That's a given. In the report here, it says temporary residential signs have no time limit. It therefore is a permanent sign. If there's no time limit, it's not a temporary sign. So we need to be honest about that and say permanent signs are allowed in residential areas, which I don't think we should ever do. People are going to advertise their private businesses, which they want to have permanently, obviously. That's not a temporary sign. And if we can't, because of the legal restrictions that we have to follow, we can't dictate what's on the sign. So there's nothing in there that says that a person that has a private business can't put a permanent sign on his garage advertising his business. And none of the proposals here would do away with that possibility. And I would not agree with any increase in the square footage of signs. There's a point where you get so many signs in residential or anywhere where it becomes blight. And I think that some of the language we're talking about here would take us into that blight area. And I don't want our residential areas to be covered with signs on a permanent basis. So I think we should keep the square footage down. And I think we should put a time limit on residential temporary signs, maybe 60 days max.
Well,
That's what I would propose.
If I want to put up 50 campaign signs, all scattered all over the place throughout the city, do I need 50 temporary sign permits? I got to fill out 50 applications at the city for that and pay the fee for 50 temporary signs.
For the residential?
Huh?
For residential?
Well, for anywhere.
Well, residential is no permit required.
Permit is required for residential signage. So we allow, again, unrestricted, which is an issue for enforcement of the time limits if we impose a time limit. The only way to impose a time limit is to have a start date, and the only way for us to get a start date is to either have a permit or some kind of registration of that sign. And again, that requires enforcement. That was one of those things that was determined at that time, at 2016, at that time, not to create additional work for city staff, not to create additional burden on a private property owner to have to register or fill out an application for permit for those individual signs. So on commercial property, you need a permit, but you need a permit for pretty much anything you do on commercial property anyway, whether it's a sign, a permanent or a temporary sign, or whether it's any kind of work on the property. So it was no additional imposition on a commercial property owner, but it would have been on a private property owner. So that was not a requirement.
Well, the examples Ken was giving across the street from him, those are all commercial, so they would have to have a permit for each one of those signs,
Actually, I believe those are campaign signs that
right?
Mr.
Are in
Marbrack's
the right
talking
of
about.
way.
And then, well, yeah, and then like the nursery across the street from you selling 3 pieces of equipment right now, and they've got big banners hanging off of those, off of the pieces of equipment for sale by owner.
And
George, I think
those-
that really underscores what I'm trying to say. The regulation of this is very difficult. I mean, we got a good geographical sized city. There's always violations. You know, do you really want to have to go after a guy that's got a sign up there? And if we tell him it's okay for 6 months, then it's going to be 8 or 9 months. Sometimes it could be bigger. It's hard to regulate it, and it's really impossible to regulate good neighborliness and good manners. I don't know how you try to do that. But I think I think you have to limit some of these things, certainly in a residential neighborhood. People don't come home to want to see a lot of advertising in their neighborhood. And that's why it's residential, not commercial. So I think when we get into redoing this, we have a lot of components to look at, and that's what I'm saying today. I think
Okay.
we're far from making a final decision for this thing.
No, we're not even close to a
Components
decision. We
really
haven't
have
had this
to be-
discussion with council
I
yet.
know next year's an election year. Fortunately, these two, one is going to be running. So the sign thing could be big. But I don't think that ever happened here. But I think those are the things we need to look at very, very closely. You're hearing
Yes.
those concerns here.
We specifically were tasked by either this body or council or both of the groups to consider enforcement, how it would be enforced, what can we do. The maximum square footage of a sign and the maximum height of a sign is very easy to determine. I mean, often you can do it without getting out of your car. Anything else beyond that becomes far more of a burden on the city to provide for the enforcement. The more you put into a regulation that requires city staff to be involved in it, the more it costs the taxpayers, right? You're sending us out, you're hiring additional staff, you're doing something that costs the taxpayers. So that was one of the things we tried to scale back at that time as well.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Mel's first here.
I don't think it's practical to try to regulate by permit in a residential area because there's so many properties, one thing, and the cost to the city. And I think the most important thing is to have good, solid, strict, sensible regulations on the books so that if someone in a residential area is exceeding that and putting too many signs, too large for too long a time, the neighbors are going to complain. They'll come in and they say, is that allowed by the code? And George will going to say, well, no, it's not. Well, then how do we get them to stop? Well, then you go out and then you enforce it. But to try to require a permit, I don't think is practical from a dollar point of view or reality.
Ted, you had something?
Kind of a question. One of my heroes is former UCLA coach John Wooden. He once said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And not implementing this LDC, the decision back in 2016, in essence, we have no plan, and that's why we see such a proliferation of signs. I think we need to come up with a plan. Do we have to do that today? Can we put this on the agenda for our next meeting?
You can follow up with additional discussion items if you
Before we go
wish.
to city
Again,
council.
Well, we're going to introduce it to the city council to start getting their input as well.
Okay.
But at some point, we're going to draft an ordinance. We're going to bring you language back to either amend it, or we're going to come back to you and say, between the two groups who have the most input and authority in the matter, we're not changing anything. So whichever direction it goes, we will
signs
be
that are-
back to you.
The signs that are out there now, the campaign signs would be considered residential?
It depends on where they are. If
Okay.
it's residential property, the use of the property and not the zoning,
And they're limited to 6 square feet.
individually 6 square feet.
But some of them are bigger than 6 square feet.
Yes, some of them are 16 square feet.
What do we do about those right now? Because that,
At this point, we haven't done anything. Again, because we're looking at potentially changing the code, we're not enforcing this. We ran into a problem enforcing this before. If we enforce it now, we're going to have the same issue go back to council and have them have to readdress what they've already addressed. They've told us, let's look at making changes and bringing those changes back to them. And it starts with talking to you about it.
now, here's a question that gets down into the weeds, but I'd like to ask it anyway. In the residential requirements, it says no time limit. And I understand that one of the reasons they said no was because that means you'd have to enforce it, which means you'd have to have a permit. When did you get it and when did you not get it? But if it's in a residential area and a neighbor has an issue with that, they can take their cell phone, take a picture, and it's got a date on it. If we put a time limit of some number, They could go out and take another picture and they say, this minus this is 61 days and the limit is 60. Couldn't they come down to city council, or not city council, but city hall and say, here's documentation, have the sign removed?
That is a potential.
Okay. Thank you.
And George, HOAs around the state, certainly, and I think around the country, are fighting this because most of them are similar to ours, where we say no signs. And then they say, well, the city says I can, and they do this. And it just creates angst. And we come home to have more peacefulness than we do angst. So I'd like to get a summation, Katie, of just like you've done here of the sign ordinance. Especially, I'm going to focus on residential, which is a surprising thing for me, but I'd like to see a summation similar to what you have up here of the pertinent items in the residential sign code. And we could go through it. Each one of us could go through it and make our comments and give it back to you, frankly.
This is it.
So this is taken.
Yeah, that's it.
That's taken from your existing land development code language.
Good, give it to us and we'll,
Well, you actually have it. It's Article 6 in the Land Development Code. So you each have a Land Development Code book. That
do.
language is the most up to date, and it includes this language.
And
Article
it's,
6.
Yeah, and it's also attached here with the staff report. It's attachment 1.
Well, isn't this normally reviewed by the Unified Development Code Committee, and then they make a recommendation to the Planning and Zoning?
They would make a recommendation to the city council generally, but yes, that's a possibility. Council could direct us to have a Unified Development Code Committee review of it. For those of you who are relatively new, Unified Development Code Committee is a composite body made up of 3 planning commissioners, 3 council members, and a member of the Board of Adjustment. And they've used them in the past when we're doing, usually it's changes that go beyond just the Land Development Code, but changes to codes. That group is pulled together and they review it based on their varying perspectives and make recommendations. If it's just the Land Development Code, tradition has been to come here because this is your primary focus is actions on or enforcement of or recommendations related to the Land Development Code.
And again, today there was no action or no motion recommended.
No, discussion only.
Today was mainly about reminding everybody of the history of what's happened and the current regulations and some of the ideas that were brought up and concerns that were raised previously so that we can start coming up with a direction for.
Just by listening to this group, there isn't really any consensus or any, hey, we really need to do this. This is going to solve all these problems. There's none of that immediate things here.
And if you need to think about it more, obviously, we're not asking for a recommendation today for that very reason, to give you a chance to mull it over, make suggestions, come up with alternatives. I mean, those options that Katie showed were just because of us. We came up with those options. You may have something entirely different you would like to see us consider, and please know that that's part of what we're asking for.
And those options are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-mm.
It's just a list of ideas.
The menu.
You could pick and choose and combine different ideas.
Terry?
I got a question for Matt. We can struggle with all of these provisions and so on and so forth. How do we enforce it? I assume the priority of this sign situation is pretty far down, I would guess. So do we have some mechanism that we can enforce it, or otherwise we just got these things?
The mechanism for enforcement would be through your code enforcement department. The problem is, we can run down these things. The reason you see a no time limit in the original temporary residential subsection of the Land Development Code is because we're watching the trends in the circuits, and they're sort of all over the place. But the general holdings are there shouldn't be time periods on residential properties. A lot of the ones that have 60-day limits have been overturned, saying they're unconstitutional, violate free speech. So as we kind of walk you through the process, this was for introduction only today, to kind of get your brains kind of wrapped around it a little bit. We'll have some answers for you.
Yep. Okay, well.
I think that's a great idea to go through the existing code and come up with ideas and come back in writing. But I wanted to ask Matt, I want to make sure what parameters we have to work under. Totally understand the free speech issue. That's a new requirement now, so we can't do that. But I don't have a good feel for, based on what you just said, what latitude do we have with the size of sign, the number of signs, the time limit, all these other things, because I think we have more flexibility there than we do in the free speech issue. So we're not totally with our hands tied of making any changes, right?
Correct. Your poll star in thinking of any of this should be the constitutional time, place, manner restrictions and what would be reasonable. And, part of what you're up against is you probably don't have as good an understanding of where the law is at this point anyway. So one of the things we can do is for your next meeting, we can go into an executive session, we can give you some legal advice as to what the parameters can be, or we can just do it in open session. It doesn't matter to me one way or the other. But there are going to be some very narrow lanes that we have to stay in when we're dealing with sign restrictions. Now, I think this is before you primarily because of the council's request when they did the moratorium last year, or a couple of years ago, and that has run on the commercial properties. Because there was a lot of pushback on time, manner, place restrictions that we placed on the commercial properties from the downtown commercial folks who had the argument, well, why should my ownership of a business restrict me more than residential? Now, certainly that is legally defensible. Commercial speech doesn't have the same level of protections as speech on somebody's residence, which is their individual kind of political speech. So I think that's why we're back. We're going to kind of walk you and we're going to walk the council through the process again to see sort of where everyone is on this. In your brains, always maintain a distinction between public property and private property having two distinct elements, residential and commercial. And then we'll talk about all that. Our right-of-way is in our city code, not our land development code. So when we talk about public right-of-way, city right-of-way, we do restrict signs going into those politicals, any signs that are other than directional signs, stop signs, and things like that. So we're always looking at that as an issue. The problem with that is that it brushes up against a state statute in Title 16 that says, regardless of whether or not a city allows signs in the right-of-way, the city, you're not allowed to go out and just willy-nilly pick those up and remove them, which is why they're still there. There's this whole sort of due process of calling the candidates and going through a process of having them remove the signs. So
I think in that's a great idea for discussion because we need to know the parameters, the rules we're working under.
Yeah, and that's
fair
fair
again,
enough.
I realize there's a point, and I've worked with different attorneys in different cities, that you say this is very important to the city, and it's a gray area in the law. We think we should go for it. If
Right.
somebody sues us because we're telling them to take down a 6-foot sign, so be it. So there's a certain point there where you have to be bold, perhaps, to get what the city really needs.
Perhaps, or you may find out the alternate to be true of the council of taking a more conservative approach and allowing for this state with a long tradition of private property rights to maybe allow a little more expansive ability to express your opinions. So.
Oh, no, I totally agree
So
with the private.
this is not an easy thing to wrap your heads around, and that's why we're only here for introduction purposes only. When the case came down out of Gilbert, which was Gilbert, Arizona, kind of set this United States Supreme Court case, Reed versus Gilbert, where Justice Thomas wrote the majority opinion saying there will be no restrictions on the content of signs, regardless of whether it's a political sign, or that case was a case where the sign was a church sign saying we are having a church service at 11 o'clock today. And I think the Gilbert Code had those sorts of signs being removed sooner than maybe a political sign. And the church made the argument, well, what's the difference?
Well,
We
yeah,
should
I
be
wasn't
allowed to pull our
suggesting
signs
that
at the
we
same time.
break the law willingly.
No, and
I mean
I'm not
that,
suggesting that
if
either.
the people of the city of Prescott come en masse to the city council and say, you've got to protect our residential areas, and if that requires a little bit of guts, maybe we need some guts.
Right.
That's all I'm saying.
No, I understand the position, and that's why we're here to talk to you guys about it.
I was okay with freedom of speech, but does that include defamation of character? If I wanted to put a sign up and said Ken Mabarak is a no good, dirty, rotten XXX, I could put that sign up?
Well, truth is always a defense.
put that
Truth is
sign
always a
up.
defense, so.
And you couldn't put it in New York because it would
I second
disappear in
that.
the middle of the night.
I will tell you, with political speech especially, you can probably get away with something like that.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
The parameters, it's called the Sullivan versus the New York Times case, and you have to knowingly understand that what you're putting forward is absolute falsehood. And if you're expressing an opinion, then, and he's running for public office. Now, it's different if it's just your neighbor and you're like, my neighbor, Bob Smith, who's not running for any political office, is an SOB. Then you have defamation protections.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Jim Lamerson, Councilman.
Thank you. As your liaison, I did want to talk to you a little bit about it. As this moves forward, I'm glad Matthew brought up a couple of things. All right? It's not just about the freedom of speech, and it's not just about your private property rights. It has to do with your oath of office. You're a duly appointed subdivision of the city of Prescott who took an oath of office. And part of that oath of office was to defend the Constitution of both the state and the federal government and the laws of the state of Arizona. Now, rest assured, when we came up with what was here 2 years ago, our attorneys advised us clearly what we came up with was defensible. All right? So as we move forward in this process, let's be very careful about making recommendations above and beyond what our attorneys sense are defensible. Okay? The idea of getting the city wrapped up in a lawsuit similar to what took place in Gilbert is not palatable. We as individuals, if we go out of the scope of our attorney's advice, are then subject individually. I'll share that with you too, okay? So I just want to lay the groundwork on some of this. Is we have all the confidence in the world in you folks, otherwise we wouldn't have appointed you here. But we need to be careful, and that's one of the reasons why Matt would want to take some of this into an executive session so you have more clear understanding of the perimeters on which we can have these kind of discussions, especially in public.
It's a great idea.
Thank you, Jim. That makes a lot of sense.
Phil Good, City Councilman. I had a chance to look into this issue because some of our, I'm also a leader of one of our local political parties. Some questions about whether homeowners associations could restrict political campaign activity and signage. Currently in Arizona Revised Statutes 33-1808, it does reference political signage in a homeowners association. And the size, the aggregate size of signs, and the amount of time that they can be displayed in an association prior to and after a campaign is specified. So I would recommend that our city attorney reference that so that you can consider and maybe including that in your concerns in this area. So at least you have alignment with Arizona Revised Statutes, and therefore if there is a challenge potentially from a resident, at least we have reference to a current state ordinance or state statute that would allow us to make some decisions in that area that would keep us from potential legal liability.
But how were they able to do that? Because then you're categorizing sign types.
Because it happened before the Supreme Court decision.
Well, whether that
Because
statute
they're
is
them?
subject to a constitutional challenge is a
Constitution was
different,
written before,
different issue,
our
right, Matt?
Constitution was written before the Supreme Court.
Well, I think what happened is that statute probably pre-exists the Gilbert decision, so we now have to look to see if that statute itself would be constitutional under the now existing Supreme Court precedent. So that's what we look
that's
at.
been constitutionally challenged, but it does exist. So at least if we were to make some decisions, we'd have that reference to,
And I think
to rely
I
on.
think you have latitude to set a time limit. It just may not be 60 days. It may be 180 days.
But then that's why we're here to talk about it, and then it's going to filter through the legal department anyway, no matter what recommendation. I think it's a great opportunity to look at some of these things, especially, I mean, we're seeing it in the subdivisions. Everybody today is all about freedom of speech and my rights, and that guy's a victim, and we're seeing it in our little 75-home subdivision, and we've got political office holders in our subdivision. And we're starting to see the attitudes are not even neighborly. I'm going to put this sign up because I want this person. And it just destroys some of the texture. And I worry that you start destroying that texture, you really start undermining a community too. So I understand we have to follow legal advice. I get that, and certainly we all do. But I think we should be able to make the recommendations that we think are appropriate for a community. And if they violate something, Matt will tell us, and we'll figure out how
in the
to
end,
modify
the
that.
council's going to make the final determination, being fully vested with any legal advice that we give them, and whether they want to choose to take a more aggressive, more conservative approach. We'll tell them what the risks and benefits may be, which is what we do, and then they'll make the decisions.
Okay, thank you. Howard, we have one member of the public here who would like to speak to this. Howard once in a while has an opinion.
Howard Mechanic, I live in Prescott, and I've been interested in this sign issue for many years, going back to when Mr. Moffett was city attorney, and I worked with him on some of the sign issues. I wanted to address more of the commercial property issues. Several of you have talked about the residential, but according to what we understand, the restrictions on commercial, and can you go back to that picture? Because I just want to point out, a lot of that is I believe is in the public right of way. This is an example that you were showing about what this temporary sign ordinance is. Those are not examples. We already have a separate regulation. You cannot put signs in the public right of way. It's not being enforced. There's over 100 signs around the city in the public right of way, not enforced. So the impression that we're giving to everybody is it's a free for all. It's a free for all. Go out and put a sign on your by the road. Put 2 signs by the road, and then somebody across the street sees that and they say, well, if he's doing that on his business, then I can do that in front of my business. There's properties up Willow Creek, and I want to get to the commercial. These vertical flags that are flying all over the city. And the regulation is, even if they're on their own property, my understanding is the regulation, they're allowed 1 sign, 1 temporary sign per commercial property. Is that correct? Which I think is reasonable if it's temporary. These are not temporary. The ones that these flags, they've been there for a year, they're not temporary. 6 months is not temporary for a commercial. The reason this was put in the code was for, if you read it, it says if somebody's having a special sale or a special promotion for their business, you don't have a 6-month special sale. You have a 1 or 2 months maximum. So I'm suggesting for commercial, there'd be a 1 or 2 month maximum. For temporary, there'd be a limit of 1. And George mentioned that we don't want the public, there's cost to taxpayer for enforcement. What I'm suggesting is there not be cost to the taxpayer. I'm suggesting a fee on commercial signs. There's 2 reasons to have the fees on a commercial sign, and a reasonable fee. The first reason is to try to limit it to a certain extent if there's a fee. If there's a $20 fee, then everybody's going to do it. If there's a $250 fee, the business may have it if they think it's a reasonable commercial investment. So I think that's the reason that we need to have the fee. The fee will also help cover the costs of enforcement. The code enforcement officers are busy doing things. The reason we have all these signs is it's not being enforced. Now, if there's a fee, maybe we can justify an enforcement on commercial signs. And if we let it get out of hand, which it is out of hand, it's hard to get it under control. But that's what I think we need to do and it's not, we're not dealing as much, I'm not saying businesses do not have freedom of speech. Businesses do have freedom of speech. But a lot of you have talked about we don't want to restrict individuals' freedom of speech on the election issue. The issues with these banners on commercial are not as much campaign issues as commercial issues. And you have the right to separate commercial signage versus the residential, so that's why I'm addressing that. I think we need to get it under control a little bit, and hopefully you can consider that. You should not do anything that you're not going to enforce. And the city has done something that it's not enforcing. And it's been doing that for years, and it's out of control. And so I think for the commercial side, it's feasible to have a limit of one temporary sign for 60 days. And it's registered. The date is noted. That way the code enforcement officers know the date it was put in. And if it's after 60 days, it goes. I think the sign ordinance, besides the temporary sign ordinance, every business has the right to have business signs. And I just think we need to have that under control. And that's my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, should we wrap this item up? Well, I guess I have a question regarding if this comes back to this group, knowing we have some major developments coming forward within the next month or so. Like today we spent 45 minutes or so on this. Is this the correct body to kind of triage this in order to pass it over to council, or should we have a separate working group, or what? Because we are going to bump up against a lot of other priorities too.
If the choice is to go with a separate working group, it would be the UDC. The Unified Development Code Committee. That's what they were created for, to be a separate working group. So that'll be a call by council. We would expect that if, once we have the introduction and discussion at council, if they choose to call a UDC meeting and send this through them for review, then those of you who are part of the representation to UDC here would be noticed for that. And we, of course, let the rest of you know that that's underway. And that may keep it from coming back to this body until the UDC's made a recommendation. So you may not see it again if council chooses to go that route.
Yeah.
Until
It'd
we're
be
ready
nice
to
if it was
actually bring it
triage when it came to us, and then we just do final discussion in not over 15 minutes or something, and
that's
move
what-
it on over to council.
That's what would happen if the UDC is involved.
Yeah. Okay. Ken was first here.
I have, in response to what Mr. Mechanic was saying, we have reviewed sign issues in this body before. The one that was always one of my pet peeves was the electronic active moving signs. When we passed our recommendation onto council 4 or 5 years ago about these electronic signs with moving words, we were real clear as to some of the dangers that we saw on Highway 69. We had several deaths over the past several years in front of the casino who had the sign that was very active, just very robust sign. And when we passed that, we said the signs, electronic signs, need to maintain their message for 30 seconds. The basis for that was traffic safety. The purpose of a sign is to distract you effectively from driving. Look at my building, look at my business. And the more they change, the more you're looking at that sign. And I can tell you, we ran into an issue with another government body, educational facility over here on Sheldon, I'm not going to say who it was, whose sign changed every 10 seconds. And if you go to that intersection, you'll see a lot of skid marks on that, coming up to that intersection. And we had other people in town who were complying with our 30-second. Embry-Riddle complied with it. Embry-Riddle's not complying anymore, and I love Embry-Riddle. The VA's not complying with it. So I think what we're talking about as far as compliance may sometimes just be a letter to people. We don't have to go kick some people in the fanny, But I think we have to enforce some things. And when the signs become a danger to the driving public, I think we really have to carefully look at that type of thing for an enforcement. And it might just be a letter to that business. And most businesses are going to say, I get it. That's fine. So, thank you.
Yeah, okay, Mel.
Yes. A few minutes ago, we were talking about, looking at the existing code and suggesting some tweaking of it. But I think now, based on what I've heard from Matt and from the councilman, that it would be a waste of time until we have better understanding of the parameters, because there's some things that there may be case law that we're not aware of that we should take into consideration before we change any one of these standards. And I'd like to have that information, so I really think if we could get a closed session might be better to do that before we submit what we think should be the changes, because I don't want to waste my time suggesting something that's somehow not constitutional or against case law or anything else.
Yeah, okay. Okay,
No action is required of you
we
today.
basically, I guess, understand that this is going to go as preliminary to council, and they're going to determine whether, I guess you'll have to have the legal discussions with council. I don't know if you're going to do an executive session with them prior to them publicly discussing this.
Again,
There's more than one of us have asked for a UDC
Mm-hmm.
meeting on such
Right.
issue. So as soon as we get apprised that the meeting's been scheduled.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
George, could I just ask one question? 'Cause
Yep.
I'm a little concerned about an executive session, because the attorney mentioned that, and I don't see why, in a public session, the attorney cannot tell you what's legal and what's not legal. Maybe he can explain why that cannot be done in a public session, to describe what the parameters are and what you need to stay into. I don't understand why that needs to be
Yeah.
outside of a public session.
Well, I agree with that in terms of what the laws are publicly, but any particular risk on individual members and going off the deep end or something individually here, I think that's okay to do an executive session. But yeah, I think that the public needs to be aware of how we are limited, because that is a lot of why we're doing what we're doing, is because of the laws on the books and precedences. So, that is important. But what does everyone think about that?
I think that's another question we have for our legal department.
Yeah.
Which would they recommend? Because they know what our
Yeah.
exposure is. So if he can give us the kind of information we need
Okay.
to make a decision on these kinds of recommendations.
Matt, it's all on you.
Putting us.
It's all on you, Matt.
It's on you as a board whether you want to get legal advice in an executive session or not. Like I said before, you don't have to. I'm perfectly happy just telling you, here's what we think the parameters.
Yeah, we're planning and zoning, and if we can make suggestions, and that's what we do. We make recommendations or suggestions.
I would imagine we're going to wait until after this thing gets to the city council anyway. Yeah. Because my concern is I don't want to be kind of arbitrating two different bodies who may have two very different thoughts in mind. So I don't know. This may be the last time we talk about it at planning and zoning, or we may be back.
Well, that's why the UDC is a combination of planning and zoning and councilmen. So I think we'd be better synchronized going through that group. Maybe make sure that we weren't going off some totally different way than the council might. Yeah, so,
And
okay.
we'll keep you apprised as we kind of figure it out internally.
Okay. Item 5 is summary of current or recent events. Do you have anything else?
I do not, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
I so move. Second.
Okay. All in favor, raise your right hand, say aye. Yep, okay, meeting is adjourned.